Vice-Chancellor, friends and colleagues, good evening. And to those of you who are visiting us for the first time, welcome to Pembroke. To alumni returning for the evening, welcome back. And a special hello to those joining us by live stream, particularly to our alumni and friends in America who I know are watching online. I'm delighted that we have a number of Pembroke students with us today, and I hope that you'll enjoy the opportunity to hear from someone who was once in a very similar position to you. We're honoured to be joined this evening by Pembroke alumnus Walter Isaacson, who in a few moments will speak to us on lessons of the great innovators, before taking some questions from the audience. Over his successful career as an author and journalist, Walter has served as the chair and CEO of CNN, editor of Time magazine, and president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. Alongside his ongoing writing projects and TV journalism, he manages to find time to be a professor at Tulane University and has been there since 2018. Today, Walter's name can be found on the covers of best-selling accounts of the lives of Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, and most recently, Elon Musk. But the beginnings of his career found him here at Pembroke, where he studied PPE as a Rhodes Scholar. After earning a BA from Harvard, Walter arrived in Oxford in 1974. He lived in a new building in the North Quad, where, according to a fellow American student who'd occupied his room a few years earlier, they put the Yanks who expect indoor plumbing there. We still do. In his application, Walter explained that I hope to move from journalism to creative writing and pure fiction, if possible. Walter's references spoke clearly of his future as a gifted journalist and biographer. One Harvard professor pertinently remarks that he is very aware of writers as human beings, and his writing is informed by a sense of his subject's character and personality, as well as by his own. His thoughts and writing are always fused with a feeling for the lives of the men and women he writes about. I expect that Walter's subsequent career came as no surprise to those professors. He has since been appointed to significant roles by George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, as well as holding high-level positions in journalism and non-profit organizations, and authoring over a dozen books. In 2012, he was selected as one of the Time 100 most influential people in the world. From a graduate job with the Sunday Times in London, Walter moved to New Orleans, then to Time magazine, where he would be appointed as its 14th editor in 1996. 5 years later, he was the chairman and CEO of CNN, and then in 2003 began as president and CEO of global non-profit making Aspen Institute. Since then, Walter served as vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Authority after Hurricane Katrina, chairman of the US-Palestinian Partnership, a member of the advisory committee of the National Institutes of Health, and chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. In 2018, he became the Leonard Lauder Professor of American History and Values at Tulane. His distinguished writing career has seen him publish biographies of numerous influential figures, from Benjamin Franklin to Steve Jobs. His latest and much anticipated authorized biography of Elon Musk was published in September last year, again topping the New York Times bestseller list and chosen as Book of the Year by Apple, Amazon, The Times, and the Financial Times. In the midst of all this, we are enormously grateful for Walter's ongoing role in the Pembroke community. As an honorary fellow, as chairman of Pembroke's Foundation in North America, and he's also offered to help by being our lead international ambassador for the 400th anniversary, a role where his reputation brings the college very significant benefit indeed. Walter, we're delighted to have you with us today. Everyone else, please join me in giving Walter a very warm welcome back.
Master and Vice Chancellor. It's an honor to be with you, the Vice Chancellor, and fellow students at Pembroke. I know that when the Master said that I was in the position of being a young student at Pembroke, I could hear some chuckles and cackles, I think mainly from Ferg and Steve and others who remember our time here. Is this working? Okay, great. But I would like to begin by saying that of all the formative influences in my life other than my parents, I think Pembroke College is truly the place where I learned both a love of learning, but of storytelling. I remember being in the Fellows Garden here. I sort of glanced at Michael Pinto-Jasinski. Is he here? And then, yes, hey, one of my Dons who there. And there was one other Don, you remember Simon Blackburn. I ran into him recently. He said, you know, if I had ever thought that you might amount to anything, I would have remembered your name when you were there. I said, thank you, Professor Blackburn. But one of the things we learned here is the intersection of people and ideas. And at both Time Magazine, as a journalist, as a writer, I've always been impressed with this notion that history is made both by great forces and by people who ripple the surface of history by touching it. I've always been somebody who felt, and I was at lunch today with some of my old Pembroke friends, they said they'd heard me say it before, but I've always been impressed ever since I was here with my fellow Rhodes. And once you've been amongst Rhodes scholars, you realize that smart people generally don't amount to very much. That it's, they're a dime a dozen. It's people who are innovative, people who are creative. And that's what I've tried to write about in all of the books I've done. It really starts with people who create revolutions. In other words, they don't just invent something, they're not just innovators, they're people who make an inflection point in history. Obviously, the scientific revolution is the one that 500 years ago sets us on the course we are today. That's Leonardo, of course, a self-portrait of Leonardo. Most people don't know that. He drawing himself, doing jumping jacks in a circle in a square, partly to connect. How do we as humans connect to the spirituality and to the science and to the math of our cosmos? Among other things, that drawing was there in order to answer the ancient riddle of how do you square the circle. Those of you who studied Euclid know it means how do you create a square the same size as a circle using only a protractor and a ruler, something that's hard to do because pi is an irrational number. But I remember going to Venice, up on the 4th floor of the Academy, and there, right in the navel, is the protractor point. And you feel, okay, here is, I'm in the present. I can just see the hand of somebody who helped bring us into a new era. Likewise, Benjamin Franklin brings this notion of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution to America and connects it to our governance. We think of him sometimes as a doddering old dude flying a kite in the rain, going a penny saved is a penny earned. But those scientific experiments were actually the most important scientific experiments of the time, after Newton, getting the single fluid theory of electricity, but more importantly, knowing plus and minus, those are the terms he used, positive, negative, for the balances, the checks and balances that he and his fellow scientist, Thomas Jefferson, then put into our founding documents. The next revolution is the physics revolution that begins, in some ways you could say it begins in 1905, from March to September, when Einstein does his 3 miracle years papers, doing quantum theory, relativity, and just that addendum near the end where he says, and if these are true, then there's a relationship between the speed of light and the E equals mc squared equation. And you have 50 years in which our history as a species is mainly affected by physics, whether it's semiconductors or nuclear explosions or GPS or space travel. All of this comes from having conquered at the beginning of 1900, Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, and others, the secret of that little kernel, the atom. And in some ways, it comes down to very small kernels, because the next is a guide RNA that can cut our DNA and change our inheritance, and you get the notion, of course, of mRNA vaccines. And finally, and more problematic if you're a biographer, is writing for 2 years alongside Elon Musk. I must say that when I was first dealing with Elon Musk, is about 3 years ago, I had done these other biographies, and so he was kind of willing to go along with me doing it. I said, well, there are two conditions. One is I don't do biographies based on 10 or 15 interviews. I do it based on 2 or 3 years of just being wherever you are, whenever I want, in any meeting, nothing off limits. And he went, okay. And then I said, well, the other condition is you don't get to read it in advance. You have absolutely no control over it. And he went, okay. And Kathy's heard this before, but I go downstairs after this very long conversation with some other people, and suddenly people say, wait, you're doing Elon's biography? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, Elon Musk just tweeted out, Walter is writing my biography. So I was, okay, I guess I got to do it. I'm on for the ride. But it was good, because two things that I really cared about: bringing us into the era of sustainable energy. He was the one doing it with 1 million Teslas being built that year, and likewise bringing us back into the era of space travel. It had been 50 years since we had sent the space shuttle up, 50 years since gone to the moon, whatever, and we'd pretty much given up on it. And now Musk was bringing humans back into orbit again. He also was bringing us into this, what I think would be as important as any of the revolutions I've talked about, into the era of artificial intelligence. We think of artificial intelligence now in the past year or so as being these large language models that can do generative predictive text, that can answer your questions, write your paper for you so that your tutor doesn't say this was not a very good paper. But in fact, what really is going to matter is real-world AI. Because when he bought Twitter, Musk, we were talking about it later, he said, well, it's somewhat serendipitous. I didn't think about it, but I now realize I have the best hive mind of humanity data feed, the 1 billion tweets per day being done. That's when he cuts off the API, doesn't let Microsoft read them, and indeed uses it for his AI. And I said to him, well, that's what you're gonna compete. He said, yes, but the main thing is we also have 1 billion frames per day from Tesla's cameras. There are 8 cameras on a Tesla. And with that, we're going to use the same sort of predictive intelligence to see how humans move through the real world. So that gets us to full self-driving, which he always says is a year away, and someday will be just a year away, and also to Optimus the robot. So all these things are part of the new revolution. And I try to look at what is it that causes people not just to be smart, but to be creative, to be innovative. And the simplest across all of them is curiosity, pure curiosity, curiosity for its own sake. Now, when I came to Pembroke, it was like, I don't know, Alice being in Christchurch Meadow, and there's just thousands of flowers blooming. And it was amazing. I could learn anything. I could go hear a physics lecture. I could learn economics. Don't correct me, Michael. I could, Hegel, Dr. Pelczynski. But the ability to be curious about everything is what sets us apart. People like Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, people in both those cases who tried to know everything you could possibly know about everything that was knowable. One of the beauties of Leonardo is we have 7,000 pages of his notebooks. And you can see dancing across these pages as we travel to Florence and Milan and Paris, and here at Oxford are some of them, and then at Windsor. These notebooks where you just see his mind working in any given day. Once again, trying to square the circle. Doing the swirls and curls, ends up becoming the Mona Lisa curls of exactly how curls work, and making a stab at Fibonacci's equation to see if he could do it, other ways to square the circle. And then on any page, a list of questions he wanted to know. One reason this is my favorite page is it has all sorts of things he was curious about that day, like how do they make the locks that divert the rivers in Milan and other mundane things. And then at the very end is describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Now, who in the world wakes up in the morning and says, I've got to know what the tongue of a woodpecker looks like? Leonardo. Not because he needed it to paint the bird in the baptism of Christ or any of his paintings. He needed to know simply because he was Leonardo. And one of the things a university like Oxford does is it pursues research for its own sake. It's not just purpose-driven research, it's curiosity, blue sky research. In fact, the blue sky is, to me, a good metaphor for it. Because as I'm reading Leonardo's notebooks, one of the questions is, why is the sky blue? Now, we all wonder that. And then, actually not in Oxford, but I didn't see a blue sky today, but we see the blue sky, but after about 7 or 8 years old, past our wonder years, we forget to ask why. There in Leonardo's notebook, he's taking water of different types, water with alcohol, purified water, salt water, and spraying it into the light to see how it diffracts the light, why the sky would be blue. What struck me, though, is I realized I'd seen the same thing in Einstein's notebooks. Even then, 400 years later, he's wondering, why is the sky blue? Dealing with Lord Rayleigh's formula, the scattering of atoms. It's part of those 1905 miracle year papers that gets him to quantum theory, but it's that pure curiosity that does it. Einstein, as a kid, always had that curiosity. His father gave him a compass when he was a kid. And Einstein was mesmerized, no pun intended, by the way the compass needle twitched and pointed north. He's like, well, nothing's touching it. There's no, so how could it be? Why would it twitch and point north? What's a force field? He began to try to figure out. Now, you may remember, I remember getting a compass when we were kids. It's like, oh, wow, look. And then a few seconds later, it's like, oh, look, a dead squirrel or something. We're on to something else. To his deathbed, Einstein is still wondering how the force field interacts with particles. Once again, as I said, it's blue sky for its own sake. When they're at Bell Labs and here at the General Post Office, trying to figure out, just out of pure curiosity, how do electrons dance on the surface of semiconducting materials? What makes them different? And they're looking at that without a particular purpose. And then in 1948, they take it, they figure out, they take some silicon, germanium, copper, put it through, looking at the dance, and they invent the transistor. The transistor is by far the fundamental dynamo of our digital age. The transistor and etching transistors on silicon to make them into microchips makes it, I see one of my students from Tulane here, he's already heard this part of the lecture, Adrian has, but makes it so that we can use logic, on, off, Boolean logic. If this, then this. We can do it in semiconducting material, and thus you have the digital revolution. Likewise, for Jennifer Doudna and the other people looking at CRISPR, CRISPR is actually some ridiculously arcane phenomenon that happens in bacteria. They have clustered, repeated interspace sequences, hence the name, and nobody knows why, or nobody knew why. They just have them there. And they're thinking, well, that's odd because they're wasting a lot of their genetics, just repeating themselves. And it turns out, they finally figure out that that's the way that bacteria fight viruses. They take a snapshot of the virus and put it interspersed in these CRISPR sequences. That seems also blue sky, pretty useless. Until suddenly, after 3 billion years of bacteria trying to fight off viruses, we get hit with having to fight off viruses. And indeed, that blue sky curiosity leads to purpose. So I saw the Vice Chancellor nodding. Even though at a great research university, and this may be the greatest, you pursue basic science just for the beauty of basic science. But the cool thing is, eventually, it might lead to something. Not if you're doing it out of pure utility, not if you've gotten a government grant to do something, but it happens that studying how a kite conducts electricity from the clouds, or how a bacteria interspaces its sequences, eventually we move along a progression that Oxford is now particularly good at, used to not be, like a lot of universities, but translating basic research into entrepreneurship and innovation. Another thing is just having that desire to explore. These are Elon Musk's grandparents. They took that little plane from the plains of Canada and flew it all over the world, ended up getting it to South Africa, which is where Elon was born. But that exploration mentality caused him, as a kid, to always be reading those science fiction books. That he was a friendless kid. He was on the spectrum, as most of you know, and really doesn't emotionally connect very well. And there he is at the corner, imagine the back of Blackwell's where they have all the science fiction, reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe and wanting to be an explorer, an adventurer about getting us back into space. It's that sense of wonder that's born partly out of curiosity, but partly out of a need to explore. The other thing that most of the characters I've written about do very well is to visualize. I mentioned Einstein and his compass. As he's trying to figure out what force fields are, he's 17, and he's looking at Maxwell's equations, which describe the force field as either light or electromagnetic. And if you look at Maxwell's equations, or if you're Einstein and you look at Maxwell's equations, they say that the field always has to travel at a constant speed. Whether you're going to the source of the light or going away from the source of the light, no matter which way you're traveling, the light always travels 186,000 or so miles per second. It's always the constant speed of light. And you've got a kid, not an old man like that, but you got a kid saying, what if I caught up with the light beam? What if I rode alongside it and I was traveling as fast as the speed of light? Then the light beam would look stationary, but Maxwell's equations don't allow for that. And he said, it caused him such anxiety worrying about this that his palms would sweat. When I was 17 or 18 wandering around, they really care that if it strikes the hour in Bern, it'll strike at the exact same moment in Basel. And the only way to do it is to send a signal between the two clocks. And the signal, of course, travels at the speed of light. And he does a thought experiment while standing at his desk in the patent office that what if you're on a fast-moving train? And the train's moving really, really fast towards one of the clocks. And somebody's on a train moving really fast in the other direction, towards the other clock. I won't explain it totally, but it's really not that hard because he comes up with the concept that what will be synchronized to the person traveling in one way is different than what will be synchronized for somebody traveling the other way. It makes just a pure leap of imagination that, oh, I get it. The speed of light is always constant, but time is relative depending on your state of motion. Now, if you don't quite get it right away, don't worry, that was 1905, he writes that paper. 1906, he's still a patent clerk. They still haven't given him his doctorate, he's still a third class. 1907, 1908, it's not until 1909 that they finally think, all right, this theory of relativity, it might have something to it, and he's finally offered a professorship. The key, and this comes from Steve Jobs, this is a poem he wrote for when he came back to Apple, is that a lot of people who are creative have been a little bit of outsiders. Leonardo, growing up in a small village of Vinci, left-handed, out of wedlock, father won't legitimate him, he's gay, he runs away feeling like a bit of an outsider. Einstein, Jewish, in Germany, in the early 1900s. Ben Franklin, a total runaway, sneaks away from his family, runs away to Philadelphia. And so that even if you're not, even if you've had, as some of us have, a nice, charmed life, that notion of stepping aside for a moment and feeling like an outsider. I remember, some of you may remember this from when Steve Jobs came back to Apple. And he decided to make a series of ads that didn't say, hey, the Macintosh is good or anything. It was just about who they were. Einstein was a part of it, Gandhi, Franklin, and others. And I remember when Steve Jobs was dying, I think it was August of 2011. He died in October. I was in the backyard of his house, and he started reciting this to me. Here's to the misfits, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebel makers, the troublemakers, round pegs in the square hole. And tears were coming, and I thought he had gotten something in his eye. And he said, no, this is so emotional to me. And then, of course, it ends with, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And for Elon Musk, that became his mantra, because I tell you, Elon Musk is crazy. Crazy in a really bad way, but also crazy enough to think that he can get astronauts into orbit, which, by the way, Boeing has figured out how to do once, but they haven't figured out how to get them back, which is a problem. That he can bring us into the era of electric vehicles. And one of the things I had to grapple with in doing Elon Musk is he's such a problematic character. But if you're going to understand, and there's only one person in history who came close, and that's Shakespeare. Whether it's Lear, whether it's Othello, anything, Shakespeare teaches us, as he says at the end of Measure for Measure, we are molded out of our faults. And so at first, as I'm doing Elon Musk, I want to take out those horrible, rough ways he does things, but also keep him as a risk taker. We were talking about at lunch today why England has yet to fully be as innovative as Silicon Valley, and part of it is this embrace of risk taking. And what Shakespeare teaches us is that sometimes you can't separate it. Sometimes our heroes also, Henry V, he kills all the prisoners. And sometimes our villains, Shylock, any of them, they all have backstories. How to understand that people are human and these things are woven together. Steve Jobs in particular had that passion that comes from that thing. When I was first working with him, that was the house, a tract home near Cupertino, California, where he grew up. And if you see that fence there, he said that he and his dad, when he was about 11, 12 years old, built that fence together. And he made me walk to the back of the house, around the block to the back, where that fence faces scrubland. And he made me feel the fence. And he said, his father was a high school dropout, auto mechanic, but he said, my father told me that we had to make the back of this fence just as beautiful as the front of this fence. And Steve said, why? Nobody's going to see it. Nobody's ever going to know. And his father said, yes, but you will know. And in 1984, when I first met him, I was a young reporter with Evan at Time magazine. They bring him up to the 34th floor. I'm the only person at the magazine, I think, using a computer. So Grunwald brings me up. There he is, and he's talking about this great new computer that he's going to come out with. When they were finishing that computer, he loved the curves, the chamfers, he called it, of the very sealed case you couldn't get into in the Macintosh. He made us look with a jeweler's loupe at the pixels on the screen that made those icons. But in late 1984, when they were just about to finish, he looked at the circuit board, and he said, this thing stinks. He actually used a 4-letter word. He said, it's ugly. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the chips aren't lined up. He said, well, nobody's going to see it. Nobody's ever going to know. And then he told them the story of his father and the fence. And they held up making the Macintosh until they could make the circuit board inside beautiful. If any of you remember the launch of the Macintosh, when was it? Super Bowl, 1985, that ad. What do you know about the Super Bowl? It means you missed the Christmas selling season by waiting until then. He held it up, missing this, so that even the parts unseen, he said, could be beautiful. And it's that type of passion, whatever you do, whether it's, you're creating reports or studies, or you're building a product or a rocket, those who care and have passions about the parts unseen are those that will succeed. He's the one he ended all of his lectures by showing this slide of the intersection of technology and the arts. And he said, those who stand at that intersection are those who will be the most innovative. And he said, Bill Gates, he said, when he went to college, all he studied was applied math. Steve said, when I went to read, I studied calligraphy, dance, music, poetry, Shakespeare. And he said, that's why Bill Gates made the Zune. You might remember what the Zune was? It was a music player that looked like it had been designed in a basement in Uzbekistan by blind people. Whereas Steve made the iPod. And that's something else you learn at Oxford, which is you get to stand at that intersection of technology and the humanities, of science and the liberal arts. Ada Lovelace, who does the first computer algorithm, is the patron saint of this. Her father was Lord Byron. When she was growing up, when Ada was growing up, her mother didn't want her to be like Lord Byron. If you knew Lord Byron, you can see why Lady Byron wasn't that fond of him at that point. So has Ada tutored only in mathematics, thinking that would be an antidote to having a poetic sensibility. But Ada ends up creating what she calls poetical science, the connection of poetry and science. And she travels the Midlands to look at the automated looms where they're using punch cards to make beautiful patterns. Her father, Lord Byron, was a Luddite. And I mean that literally, because his only speech in the House of Lords is supporting the followers of Ned Ludd, who were smashing those looms, saying that the technology would put people out of work. That's what the Luddites believed then, in the 1840s. That's what Luddites believe now. They were wrong then, they're wrong now. Technology does not put people out of work. It opens up new types of opportunities. But she looked at the punch cards that were making those patterns beautiful, and she realized that with her friend Charles Babbage making a calculating machine, you could use those punch cards, as she wrote, to do not just numbers, but anything that could be notated in symbols: music, words, patterns, art. In other words, the notion of the general purpose computer. And thus you have, whether it be Leonardo to Steve Jobs to Elon Musk, those people who try to stand at that intersection. The great example is the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is a very spiritual painting. He does it because he wants to show how the rivers come down from the ancient eons of time and connect into the veins of our body. The metaphor of that with the river, the roads of civilization, the veins of our body in the Mona Lisa. But it's also a great triumph of science, because early on in his career, he painted the wife of a Florentine cloth merchant called, her name was Ginevra da Vinci. You can see it in Washington. And it's just like this, three-quarter profile of the river coming down, but it clearly isn't the Mona Lisa. What it is the painting by somebody who would someday paint the Mona Lisa. Great historians, including Oxford's wonderful Martin Kemp, blame Leonardo for, quote, wasting too much of their time doing science, trying to figure out how to square the circle, trying to figure out optics, dissecting the human body. Said, oh, he could have done so many more paintings had he not done so. But I believe if you look at those two paintings, you see what a lifetime of being curious about everything, from the tongue of a woodpecker to the flows of rivers to the optics, helps inform how we see the world. He dissects the human eye and figures out that light coming directly into the retina. You see details, but the light that comes in more from the corner gives you shadows and colors. He also dissected every muscle and every nerve in, I think it's 15 cadavers of the human face to figure out exactly how the lips work, that there's a muscle that allows you to take your lower lip and pucker it, or you can pucker both your lips, but you can't pucker your top lip alone. No, don't try it. Wait till you get home. And you see him doing it, and this is well before he's starting to paint the Mona Lisa, but there it is, faintly, on top of that notebook page, he's beginning to do the smile. And so when you see the smile, if you look at every one of the details, like the heart pocket, actually go down. She's not smiling. Even here, there's a little bit going down. But the shadows and the colors go up. And that makes it interactive, so that when you move your head, when you're looking at her, you wonder, is she smiling? And then you turn slightly, and the smile reacts to you, and then you turn back, and it reacts. And this is a whole new way of combining art and science. As I said, page after page, just trying to square the circle, doing it with Vitruvian Man. The other thing that's important in innovation is to collaborate. Those of us who are biographers have a dirty secret, which is we get history wrong a bit. We make it seem like a guy or a gal goes to a garage or to a garret, and they have a light bulb moment, and the internet happens or whatever. With all due respect to Al Gore, the internet is not invented by one person. It is a collaborative thing, just like most great inventions were. And at one point, the reason they're doing the internet is so that research universities who had funded computers, both in England and in America, each wanted computers that do everything. One that would do graphics, one that would do analytics, one that would do data processing. And they decided, no, let's hook the computers together so that you can share, time share. And they told the research universities, you just have to figure out how to connect it to this packet switch network. And the packet switching, of course, was done here in England, and it meant that instead of having just a single circuit going to a hub, you broke all Steve Crocker who was one of the graduate students back there, said, no, we weren't doing it to help the Pentagon fight a nuclear war. I mean, we were graduate students in the 1960s. Why were we graduate students? We were avoiding the draft. And he said, yeah. And so I asked Steve Lukasich, who was then the person in the Pentagon, the colonel who was in charge, I said, I've been told that they say no. He said, oh yeah, we didn't tell the graduate students that's why we're doing it. They were avoiding the draft. You tell Crocker that he was on the bottom and I was on the top. So he didn't know what was happening. So I went back, coffee shop in, near Bethesda, one of those, and I'm sitting with Crocker, and I said, Colonel Kasich said he was on as you keep turning, it goes faster. When you hit the button, it plays. That's it. Steve loved it. But then he said, when they showed it to him, there was a little button there. He said, what's this? After he said, what the is this? And they'll a little pause for a moment, and they say, it's the on-off button. And Steve nods and says, what does it do? More. They said, Steve, it turns it on and off. And he says, why do we need it? And then they realize you don't need an on-off button in your iPod. It knows, if you quit using it for a while, to wind down, it knows how to come back up. And it's that leap of simplicity that you see, this is Elon Musk, figuring out that he looked at a toy car, one of those Tonka to whatever, and the whole underbody is one piece. It's just a little tiny piece of cast metal. So why can't we do that with a real car? And they finally make a casting machine that in one piece can do the entire underbelly of the car. There are many more lessons. I know I'm standing between you and drinks. I'll just say a few of them quickly. Jennifer Doudna, as I said, knew the notion of aiming ahead. That while everybody's looking at the DNA, she shoots ahead of the duck, trying to figure out where it's going. Likewise, the notion of executing. Steve Jobs had a line that vision without execution is hallucination. Actually, Steve Jobs was not very good at that. He envisioned great things, great phones, great computers, but then he just threw in Johnny Ive, or Sir Johnny Ive, I should say here, threw him over the wall to China and let them manufacture it. Steve never went to any of the manufacturing plants. Musk believed that figuring out the manufacturing, living on the factory floor, that was the key to innovation, because you get the feedback loop that every day on the assembly line as things happen. And he makes his engineers, like himself too, their desks are not in some design center somewhere. They're along the assembly line in Austin and in Fremont at the Tesla factories, and in Boca Chica and Hawthorne at the SpaceX factories. And then, this is why the humanities matter, what you're doing matters, is the notion that all of our technology, AI being the latest example, we have to connect it to our own moral sensibility. Yes, we'll be able to edit DNA, but does that mean we want to have a genetic supermarket where your kids will be able to go to the clinic and get a checklist and be told, blue eyes, you want that, what hair color, height, you want extra height, IQ, someday, maybe. And what will that do if we can design out things, whatever, skin color, eye color, whatever you want to think about. And what will that mean if we have, I think Huxley does it in Brave New World, have almost two classes of people, those who can afford to have genetically enhanced kids versus those who don't. These are questions we're going to have to deal with in the next 20 or 30 years, a lot of it being done here at Oxford, out at Berkeley, and other places. But whatever it is, whether you figure out social media, where we screwed it up, but if you look at most of our technology, we don't screw up. Even the atom bomb, which Evan has written a book on it, whether the question of dropping it at that time on Japan. But whatever you think about that question, it's pretty amazing that so far now we've been able to keep that genie back in a bottle. That is not true of social media. We thought it was going to connect the world. It ended up, in my opinion now, being slightly more harm than good, because we didn't embed our moral sensibilities into social media. That's going to be true of AI. It's going to be true of gene editing. I see Bruns, I see Evan, I see all of us who graduated from our own college before I came here. We had a great minister there, the Reverend Peter Gomes. And on the day we graduated, he gave a sermon that I'll always remember. And it was called What We Forgot to Tell You. And he said, I talked to some people in your class, and one of them, I asked him what he wanted to be. And that person said, I want to be really successful. I want to be really powerful. I want to be influential. I may even want to be president. And Reverend Gomes said, aim higher. This college has turned out a lot of powerful, a lot of successful people. It's even turned out a few presidents, but it hasn't turned out enough good people. Aim higher. Always try to be the person who's going to do good. And so I look at each of the people I've written about throughout their lives. There's Leonardo on his deathbed. There's his last notebook page. It's up in France. There he is, line after line, still knowing he's not going to make it, trying to figure out a way to square the circle, using a right triangle, a ruler, the gray area, having a chart showing how it worked, to get to this final line that says, in a slightly different handwriting, but the soup is getting cold. You can imagine his cook, Madalena, downstairs with his students all there, as he's there trying to do this in his notebook. And they're saying, come on down, but the soup is getting cold. For those of us who are getting into that period of life where the soup's starting getting cold, you admire the people who keep it going like that. Einstein, too, there he is at Princeton, has an aneurysm. It bursts. He's in Princeton Hospital. All the visitors. He knows he's not going to make it, much, for another day even. And at 9 p.m. when the visitors got to go, he has Helen Dukas, his assistant, bring him his papers. They're still there, pictures of them. And this is the last notebook page, where he's doing line after line of equations, even making some math mistakes and correcting them. Line after line of equations, trying to figure out what he would call the unified field theory, the notion of how a force field and how a particle would, or to put it more simply, why does that compass needle twitch and point north? So he does one last line of equations, which he thought would get us one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. When I was with Steve Jobs in that late summer of 2011, I asked him what he thought it was all about. He said, my guru in India taught me a couple of things. But he said, life is like a river. And when you're successful, you get to take things out of the river. And if you're very successful, you take everything from the ideas to the products to the inventions they've all done. But now I realize it's not what you get to take out of the river, it's what you got to put into the river. And as for Benjamin Franklin, on his deathbed, he had been the largest contributor to every church that had been built in Philadelphia. At one point, they're building a new hall, which is right to the left of Independence Hall. It's still called the New Hall. And for those of you who do fundraising, it's a great fundraising document. It begins by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer them a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn something. And on his deathbed, he's the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. And so when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying him to his grave in Philadelphia, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews and marched him to the grave. That's what they were fighting for back then, and that's what both here in the UK and in Europe and around the world and in the United States we're still fighting for. Thank you all very much. And one last thing, if you don't mind, Master. The tongue of the woodpecker is 3 times as long as the beak. So when the beak hits the bark, it helps cushion the brain so the brain doesn't get hurt. Yeah, There is no reason you need to know that. It is useless information. Useless to you, just as it was to Leonardo, who 500 years ago described the tongue of the woodpecker in his notebook. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was nothing short of a masterclass. To be able to go from the beginning of time to the present day and persuade us all of the purpose in being here is absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Master.
Thank you for being part of Pembroke, and thank you for giving us such a valuable part of your time. We have a few more minutes. Walter knows I have to disappear for 10 minutes and then reappear. But I gather you're willing to take some questions.
Sure, but I mean, there are people who may want to have drinks, which I think are here. So I only did two, because I see a hand up already.
Some questions, and then
but I don't want to stop. I see the bartenders moving out right away. So I know we have to be fast here. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question? Walter, do you draw any distinction, and if so, how, between innovation that helps humanity and innovation that potentially could hurt humanity based on our different definitions of what being moral may be?
Yeah, technology I don't think necessarily has a moral arc to it. It's as good or as bad as we make it. Whether it's creating nuclear energy, creating social media, creating AI. What we always have to do is make sure we're in control of our technology. That Elon, when he read the Isaac Asimov books as a friendless kid, always worried that the robots would turn on us. I think if we keep a symbiotic, tight relationship with our machines, then we don't have to worry about the technology being inherently good or inherently bad. We have to worry about being as good or as bad as we make it to be. And I think we forget that at our peril, and we forgot that. Maybe I'm really on a jag now, especially since Elon bought Twitter, about social media. But we forgot that there's supposed to be a moral purpose to the technology we create. Yes, okay. We're going to do three real quick ones. So put your hands up, and I only, yes.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you for your talk. I think my question is, in all your time studying these great innovators who work with books and work with literature and humanities and then move into just creating things in science, is there like what does innovation look like to you outside of science, outside of technology? Is there some kind of
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's always about thinking out of the box. One of the great creative things that I've studied a bit was trying to write a book on, but never was. Improvise, and you can, somebody should do, there have been a few books on it, but the period 1900 to 1914, when the war breaks out, where everything is going nuts, where Einstein and Marie Curie are figuring out the uncertainties of the atom, Picasso is doing it, Joyce is doing it, Faulkner, whatever it may be. So I think you can see it in any endeavor, but I will add the caution that people, perhaps like yourself, I don't want to typecast you, but who care about the humanities, often feel that it's really bad if people don't understand the humanities. But they may be people who say, oh yeah, but I don't know the difference between an integral and a differential equation, or the difference between a transistor and a resistor. So those of us who love the humanities have also got to make the effort to love the sciences. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isaacson. What I want to ask is, where should we draw the red line of the technology advance and the morality? And the second one is what the scientists should do in the future. Because now it's the phenomenon that the morality keeps changing. Because at Leonard's time, you just said he dissects people, and at that time it's illegal. This is against the morality. And Turing, he's a homosexual, and at that time it's illegal as well. And the second thing is that
Let me just, since we have so many questions, let me just take the first, if you don't mind, and over drinks. Yeah, being the outsider helps. Turing was, Leonardo was, whatever. And I think being an outsider helps you understand that you have to draw a line sometimes, that we have to protect different people. I don't know the full answers. This is going to be the challenge of your generation, is to figure out how to apply our morality to technology that's moving at such a fast speed. Yeah. Well, that's one, I think, right?
The stories that you share to you as a person, right? So you've been exposed to all this innovation, creativity, and I was wondering, we've heard quite a bit about you, but it was all successes. So have all these stories helped you deal with failure?
Yeah.
And what have you learned?
Yeah, I've actually had close to as many failures as I've had successes. And taking risks is something that I think is key to innovation, and it's something that isn't done quite as well here as in Silicon Valley. One of my biggest failures is I was a journalist. I worked at Time Magazine. The company that owned it owned CNN, moved me to CNN, told me I had to do television journalism. I was very bad at it, and I learned a lot from it. One of it is that you really have to know that God is in the details, and the devil's in the details. I knew how to lay out a page of a magazine. Evan and I used to report stories together. It was a pretty good report I get. When I went to TV, I did not know the details well, and thus I was not a good leader. And secondly, you got to learn in life, how do you want to lead? Do you want to lead with, by having new ideas, imagination? Do you want to lead by being a manager and running things? That's a really difficult talent, believe it or not, being a manager and running things. And I learned that I did not have the talent for that. So the greatest piece of wisdom I can give you on that is the oldest piece of wisdom we know of in the humanities, which is the one inscribed on the temple at the Oracle of Delphi, which is know thyself. and to figure out as you go through life, what really gives me pleasure, what am I good at? And then the next big thing, because there are a lot of people say follow your passion. It's not about your stupid little passion. It's about connecting your passion to something larger than yourself. So know what your passions are and know how to connect it. Thank you all.